Before you stand only 40,000 Romans. Opposite them, almost 1 million northern barbarians. Now imagine this. Those 40,000 don't just survive. They destroy that entire million. This is not a movie script. This is a real story. And today, we'll find out what allowed these seemingly doomed legionaries to do the impossible, to grind down an army 25 times larger than their own. By the end of the 2nd century BC, Rome looked powerful and unbeatable. Carthage was destroyed, the Mediterranean was under control, and there seemed to be no serious enemies left. But far in the north, a storm was already gathering. From northern Europe came the tribes of the Cimbri and the Teutones. This was not just an army. It was an entire people on the move. Wagons, herds, women, children, old men. A whole migrating state. At the front marched the warriors. Behind them came their entire world. Rome tried to stop them, and time after time suffered humiliating defeats. The climax was the disaster at Arausio. In a single day, the legions were simply swept away. Tens of thousands of soldiers lay dead on the battlefield. Panic broke out in the capital. People whispered that the barbarians were about to break into Italy and that Rome was doomed to a foreign slaughter. It was at this moment that Gaius Marius stepped onto the stage, a new consul chosen not for beautiful speeches, but because there were no other options left. He inherited a shattered, exhausted army, and an enemy whose name people were afraid to say out loud. Before Marius, only a Roman citizen who owned land and had enough money for his own equipment could become a soldier. It looked good on paper, but by the end of the century, there were far fewer such citizens. The rich bought their way out of service, the poor sat idle, and the legions were melting away. Marius did what conservatives considered almost a crime. He opened the doors of the army to the very poor, to those who had no land, no property, only their bodies, their health, and a desire to escape poverty. Now the state itself provided the equipment. In return, it received a soldier, for whom service wasn't a duty, but the only chance at a normal life. No wonder such people could be turned into fanatically tough fighters. But motivation alone wasn't enough. Marius changed the very lifestyle of the legionary. Each soldier carried everything himself: armor, weapons, food, a cooking pot, tent pegs, even a shovel. Up to 30 kilos of gear per person. For this, they were nicknamed Marius's mules. But this gave the army its main advantage: independence. A legion could move fast, without being tied to huge supply trains. Where other armies got bogged down for weeks, the Romans covered the distance in days. A legionary's day turned into a harsh routine. Early rise, simple breakfast, exhausting march. Then, not rest, but work. Digging ditches, building fortifications, training. No days off, no indulgences. Discipline stopped being just a word. It became their new religion. Step by step, Marius turned a crumbling army of small landowners into a professional machine. And then he had to do the hardest thing: test this machine in battle against a living sea of barbarians. When Marius's legions reached the north, not far from the borders of Italy, it became clear who they were really up against. On the horizon moved not a neat army, but a huge, endless procession. Wagons, bundles of livestock, the smoke of campfires, a long line of people stretched out for kilometers. In front, the Cimbri and the Teutones in battle formation. Behind them, their families. They had not come on campaign. They had come to seize new land and settle there forever. The scouts who returned to camp all said the same thing: there are too many of them. By different estimates, there were hundreds of thousands of warriors, and with their families up to 1 million people. And Marius understood perfectly well. To go out into an honest, pitched battle against such a mass meant simply handing over his legions to be slaughtered. So he chose a way that many at the time took for cowardice. In reality, it was a cold-blooded game of endurance and nerves. Marius refused to give the enemy an immediate, heroic battle. Instead, he started doing what the Romans did better than anyone: building and waiting. Every day the legion built a fortified camp on advantageous high ground. Ditches, ramparts, palisades, straight rows of tents, orderly streets. Each camp was like a small, strong town that sprang up in just a few hours. From the outside, it drove the barbarians mad. They were used to an enemy who runs out into the field and rushes into a furious fight. Here, silence behind the walls, straight lines of shields and spears, torches at night. The Romans seemed to ignore their screams and threats. The barbarians staged shows. They rode forward, beat their spears against their shields, roared, shouted challenges. In response, nothing. The legion stood mute like a stone wall. At the same time, Marius was not sitting idle. He sent small detachments on quick raids, hit the stragglers, burned part of the wagons, destroy food supplies, and vanish before the main mass could turn around. Each such raid struck not so much at the enemy's body as at his nerves. There seemed to be few Romans, yet they gave no peace. While the barbarians raged and lost their order, the legionaries did what they were used to, marching, building, strengthening the camp, drilling their strikes. For them, the war turned into the same day on repeat: work, order, sleep. For the Cimbri and the Teutones, into the chaos of waiting. And at some point this tactic cracked not in the Roman, but in the barbarian army. The allies split. The Teutones moved toward Provence, hoping to break through into Italy, and the Cimbri stayed in the north. This was exactly what Marius had been waiting for. Now before him was no longer one giant avalanche, but a separate part of the enemy that could be dealt with on its own. Marius chose the place for the first decisive clash himself. A small river, hills, ravines. All this made the terrain perfect for an ambush. In full view of the Teutones, the Romans set up an ordinary camp. Everything as usual: order, ditches, walls. The barbarians saw it as a challenge. Finally, the enemy seemed ready to come out into open battle. But at night, part of the legionaries quietly left the camp and went beyond the hills. Several thousand men lay down in ravines and thickets, covering themselves with cloaks, trying even to breathe so that the steam wouldn't give them away at dawn. In the morning, the Teutones formed up in a huge mass and moved forward. Step by step, the field filled with people and shields. Shouts, thunder. The Roman line was silent. The legionaries waited until the enemy came within throwing distance. On the signal, the air filled with whistling. Thousands of heavy javelins flew into the packed crowd. Shields were pierced. Men fell. The rest of the mass crashed into the Roman shields, and a brutal close-quarters fight began. And just when it seemed that the Romans would simply be crushed by sheer numbers, dust rose behind the Teutones. The hidden detachment was coming out of its ambush. It slammed into the rear of the barbarian mass. The Teutones were caught between two walls of shields. In front, the Roman line. Behind, the same Romans. There was nowhere to run. A massacre began, and there was no way out of it. The field slowly turned into one solid tangle of bodies, blood, and screams. When the battle was over, tens of thousands lay dead on the ground. Part of the people had been killed, part taken prisoner. And what happened next shocked even the Romans. The women, realizing they had lost, did not beg for mercy. Chroniclers write that many of them first killed their children and then themselves, just to avoid being taken into slavery. It was the end, not just of an army, but of an entire way of life. For Rome, this was the first breathing space. In the city, they began to pray for Marius as for a savior. But he understood. This was only half the storm. The second blow was still ahead. While Marius was dealing with the Teutones, the Cimbri were preparing to invade from another direction. There were even more of them. And if they had managed to break into Italy before the legions arrived, everything Marius had done could have turned to dust. At this stage, speed was everything. And here, the strength of the new army showed itself. The legionaries marched 20 to 25 kilometers a day over rough terrain, loaded with their usual backpack of iron, wood, and food. Halt, and straight to work. In a matter of minutes, they set up camp, laid out streets, dug a ditch, raised walls. They were like a moving factory of war that built itself a mini-fortress every evening, and at dawn broke it down and went on. Their nickname Mules sounded like a joke, but in reality, it became a mark of inhuman endurance. That was what allowed Marius to stand in the path of the Cimbri in time and keep them from falling on a defenseless Italy. The decisive battle took place on a plain in northern Italy, not far from a river. In the morning, mist still lay over the ground as the Roman legions formed their battle line. In front of them, beyond the strip of fog, rose the ranks of the Cimbri. There were so many of them that ancient authors said the hills turned into men. Behind the barbarians stood wagons arranged in a semicircle. Behind those, women and children. This was their last line, both home and fortress. Marius understood that simply slamming into this mass meant drowning in it. So again he bet not on brute force, but on order and cunning. He arranged the legionaries in several lines. Part of the troops he kept back, so that the enemy would not see them immediately. The front line drove javelins into the ground at an angle, turning the space before it into a zone through which cavalry and infantry would struggle to pass. When the Cimbri attacked, at first everything looked simple. A huge mass of people slowly picked up speed, roared, drums setting the rhythm. At some point, the Romans just disappeared inside this avalanche. That's how it looked from the outside. But inside the avalanche, a strict system was working. The first Roman line took the blow, then on signal stepped back a little, letting the second line throw its javelins. The heavy shafts with soft iron heads stuck into the Cimbri shields and bent, gluing the shield to the arm. The warriors tried to rip them out, but instead wasted time and exposed themselves to attack. Officers with transverse crests on their helmets ran endlessly along the ranks. Their shout was always the same. "Close up!" The Roman line tightened, shield to shield, each man covering his neighbor. In the crush, short Roman swords worked better than long barbarian blades. Here it wasn't the beauty of the strike that mattered, but its accuracy. Marius stood not in the front line, but on a rise. His task was not to fight personally, but to control the entire battlefield. Orders were carried by the sound of horns and trumpets, as well as by smoke and fire. To a simple soldier, this was just noise and signals. To the commander, it was the language he used to move tens of thousands of men. The longer the battle lasted, the harder it became for the Cimbri. The sun rose higher. It grew hot. Shields were heavy, armor pressed on them. The ground under their feet turned into mud mixed with blood. The Romans were exhausted too, but they had something the enemy didn't: a reserve prepared in advance. At the worst moment, when the barbarians were still pressing on the front, fresh cohorts that the Cimbri hadn't seen before came out from behind the hills. They hit the flanks. For the barbarians, it was like a blow from an invisible enemy to the ribs. The crowd began to waver. Shouts of, "They've outflanked us!" spread faster than sound. Those in the rear tried to run, but ran into their own wagons and women. In front, Roman shields. On the sides, new detachments. Behind, their own camp. When the battle ended, the field turned into a solid layer of bodies. By some estimates, up to 100,000 barbarians died that day, and tens of thousands were taken prisoner. Roman losses were incomparably smaller. For the Cimbri, this was the end. For Rome, the day the Republic seemed to come back from the dead. Rome celebrated. Marius was called Savior of Italy, new founder of the city. He was greeted with wreaths and shouts, and stories spread of how he had, with 40,000, surrounded almost 1,000,000. But behind all this delight, another truth was hiding. The army that had won these battles was no longer the old citizen army that served the Republic simply because the law said so. It was an army of the poor, for whom the main figure was not the Senate, but their general. Marius gave them armor, food, land after service. He became the man on whom their future depended, and they knew it very well. They fought not for an abstract Rome, but for the commander who had given them a chance to stop being nobodies. Along with this, the personal power of the general grew. Marius became consul again and again. Traditions collapsed, and with them, the balance of power. A few years later, another man appeared. Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Once he had served under Marius, then he became his enemy. Each of them had his own legions, his own soldiers personally loyal to him. And at some point, Roman troops for the first time turned their spears not against external enemies, but against their own citizens. What had begun as reforms to save Rome turned into the source of civil wars that would slowly eat away at the Republic. 40,000 Romans and Gaius Marius saved Rome from the barbarians. But for this victory, the Republic paid with future civil wars. That is how it often is with great triumphs. On the outside there is glory and shine, but inside there is a crack that one day will split the whole state apart.